This is going to be a video about how to change the upper and lower ball joints on a Mitsubishi Triton. I think it's about 2004 model. I believe it has a lot in common with some of the similar era of Pajero, although I think there are some differences. It's a four-wheel drive. The torsion bar suspension is in place, and one of the, I guess, kind of interesting things about doing this is that the whole time that you are working on this component here, the torsion bar is trying to push down with considerable force. So you need to be bearing that in mind when you're doing things with it and jacking it and so on and taking it apart, that at all times that torsion bar, well, you can't see it, but the torsion bar back here is trying to twist this down ferociously. So just bear that in mind with every major move you do, so you don't lose a finger or get hit by something. I've already done the passenger side, so hopefully doing this side should be a lot faster, since I now in theory know a bit about what I'm doing. So here's the upper ball joint here. The lower ball joint is down there, probably not visible to the camera at this point. I have already removed from here the tie rod end for the steering, because I'm replacing those tie rod ends as well. Unquestionably, the most difficult aspect of this job is getting the lower ball joint out, because it's a little hard to explain, and I'll show it when I'm doing it, but essentially this needs to go up in comparison to the hub, and there's only limited clearance for it to come up before it hits the CV joint here. Some people say that you need to take the whole hub off. I managed to do it on the other side without taking the whole hub off, and that's what I plan on doing on this side. Whether that's because this is a slightly different model to the models where they say you've got to take the whole hub off to do this job, or whether I just managed to find a way to wriggle it off that other people haven't, I'm not sure. But if you get nothing else from this video, hopefully you'll be able to see how I managed to do it without getting the hub off, and there are a couple of tricks to it. The first thing you need to do is take the brake caliper off. The hub is going to be completely loose when you've got both ball joints out, and if you don't take the brake caliper off, then the hub will be hanging by the brake hose, which is, needless to say, very bad. So you need to take this off, and I'm just going to wire it up so it's hanging up in here and out of the way. Okay, I've got the brake caliper out of the way. And the next thing that needs to happen is that I need to loosen off the bolts holding the upper ball joint in place. They are so muddy I can barely find them, but they are a bolt rather than a stud, so they may start to spin, and you may need to put a 12mm spanner on the back of them to get them to go. You can barely see it under all this mud, but under here there's a castle nut. I can actually see what I'm doing. So just remove the split pin. Okay, that's the split pin out. Now this is actually a 22mm. I don't have a 22mm socket, but luckily a 7/8 socket, which I do have, is pretty much exactly 22mm. For those not familiar, the ball joint is a ball sitting up in here held by 3 bolts in a casing, and it has a tapered pin coming down which goes through the top of this control arm here. And after they've been in for a few years, they are very hard to get out. In theory, when we take this off, this can all fly apart. In reality, I'm sure it won't, because it'll be too stuck in. But when we do eventually separate this, what's going to happen is that the hub and the lower control arm are no longer going to be attached to the upper control arm. And because the upper control arm is sitting on its bump stops, it's the only thing that's holding the hub and the lower control arm from flying downwards under the pressure from the torsion bar suspension. So what I'm going to need to do is put a jack under here to support this, so that when it does eventually let go, It's not going to fly downwards and cause damage. One of the little tricks I learned when I was doing the other side was that when you are trying to get the new ball joint in here, what you do is you get a jack under here and you lift this up and lift the hub up onto the new ball joint. Now, one of the problems is that as you do that, this control arm, which doesn't have anything holding it down, will tend to go upwards, and so you end up chasing the control arm up, which is a pain. So one of the tricks that I learned last time is to get a C-clamp and just put it from the bump stop here over the top of the control arm and just tighten it up, and that way it can't go upwards and you're not going to have the problem. You'll probably see when I put the new control arm later in what I'm talking about. Okay, now having put that on, I'm now just going to take the weight of the control arm on the jack underneath. Just a word on positioning your jack. Under here, there are the bolts that hold the lower control arm on. And if you put your jack under here, you're not going to be able to get at those. And it's easiest to be able to just leave the jack in place for the whole job. So put your jack in further back on the control arm, away from the bolt ends or the nuts on the other side, so that you don't have to move it when you're trying to undo those bolts. Wasn't too bad actually. There's various tools used for taking tie rod ends and ball joints out of when they're stuck, as they always are. You can, and I did this in the last one, I must admit, just leave those bolts in and whack on the end here. Obviously that destroys the thread, but if they're an old control arm you're throwing away, it probably doesn't matter. In this particular case, that's pretty hard to do because you can't really get a good swing at it because of all of this stuff in here. So the more controlled way of doing it, you can get what they call a pickle fork, which is like a fork, a wedged fork, which you put in here and you bang it in on, and it drives the joint apart and pulls the pin out. There's a few problems with them. The first thing is that they dig into the rubber seals here, so they wreck them. So that's the same as hitting on the end with a hammer. You're never going to be able to use it again. The second thing is, I just find that they just don't work a lot of the time. You just can't get enough force on them. So the best type is, I think, this sort, which is they call a scissors sort, which effectively, if you can see it, goes in here, and then with this part around the top and this lever on the pin, and then you just undo this, do up this bolt here, and it forces the joint apart. To stop it flying away when it all comes loose, they do have a cord on them. Now, sorry about the lighting on all this, by the way. It's just a bit hard because I've got the afternoon sun behind me and it's creating bright areas and shadow areas, but there's not much I can do. I find that often to get it to go in under the seals and seat firmly, you do need to whack it on the hammer. Okay, that's in now. There it goes. As you can tell, there's a fair old bit of force on that. That's actually, by the standards of ball joint pins, it's actually pretty easy compared to some of them I've got apart. Now that theoretically can now just come out. One of the things I've noticed with these is that the rubber seals are very tight, and you actually have to take the rubber seal off to get them to come out. That's the easy one. Now I've got to get out the bottom ball joint. Unfortunately, because of the light levels, this is going to be pretty terrible, but hopefully you can see that down here there are 4 bolts, 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts. This is the ball part of the ball joint sitting in here, and the castle nuts here, and the pin goes through here. A couple of little tricks you might not necessarily realise at first, I certainly didn't last time, is that here there is a little bolt comes through a hole, which is the stop for the steering, and on the other side, in roughly the same place, there is the grease nipple. Undo this and take it out, and take the grease nipple out on the other side, and it allows the whole thing to move more freely and gives you more room to move when you're trying to wriggle it all out. These are 17mm, and once again they are bolts, they're not studs, so that you do need a spanner on top and a socket underneath. It's easiest to do two on one side and then the other two, because the CV joint blocks access, so you do these two and then you shift the whole hub across and like that, and then you can do the ones on the other side. Okay, so now the only thing left to do is the castle nut down the bottom. Alright, split pin together. Got the split pin out now, I just need to undo the castle nut on the bottom of the lower ball joint. It's a 24mm socket. Well, that took a bit long pipe extension to get that one broken out. Another thing that I forgot to mention before was that these jaws here, which have to go around around the pin down here, when I first got these, they had a 19mm opening here, and these ball joints are about 22 or even 23mm. Or sorry, I should say this, the pins in these are 22 or 23mm. I had a look at it and I thought there's enough meat in it that I can afford to shave a bit off, so I actually got out my Dremel and just ground out here till I had a wide enough opening to go around these ball joints. And I hear that is a common problem. These do tend to be 19mm in size, and yeah, the Triton and I think the Pajero as well have bigger ball joints than that, so you do have to grind it out or get a bigger one from somewhere. 1, 2, 3. No, that's not come out yet. Right, I'm going to ease that off. If you give it a really good whack here, you can loosen it off. Right, give it another try. There we go. Oh, that definitely was a lot easier after I'd given it a whack with a hammer. That's a good tip. Okay, now as you can see, maybe, hopefully, here's the ball joint body itself. Down in here is the pin starting to come out, and you'll see that the bottom of the pin where the nut was has started to go up now. But the problem, and this is really the most difficult aspect of this whole thing, is that in order to get that out, you've got to wrestle with it. This has to come up, and it can't come up far enough because it can only come up that far, and that still leaves the pin in by maybe 15mm, but it can't go up any further because this, the CV joint, hits on the control arm. And this is why people say you have to take the whole thing off. But the last time I did it, I was actually able to wriggle it out. Okay, now I think I've remembered how the trick works. You basically have to lift it up like this, pull the pin out as far as you can. You have to push the pin upwards and the hub downwards, and then roll it over and lay it so that the hub is almost flat, just hanging from the axle as far back as possible. And if you do that, and then wriggle it around a bit, you can get it to come the whole way out, as it now is. And out you come. So okay, so now I've got everything out. What I'm going to do, I'll turn off the camera for this, but I'm going to get some degreaser and just wash and spray the whole thing down before I start putting new components in. Okay, that's better. The sun's gone down a bit now, and it's all hopefully a bit more even lighting, which might give you a better chance of being able to see anything. Okay, and I've given it a good hose, so hopefully it is now ready to all go back together. So step one is to get that pesky lower ball joint back in, or a new one anyway. So here's the new one. To get it on, you really need this right over to one side, and when you do that, it tends to pop the rubber out of its groove. Well, I'll put it on for the moment, but yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if it pops out during the operation. I have to put it back on again afterwards. And when you get the new ones, they are very stiff. You can't really, I don't think you can move these by hand. I'll give it a try, but yeah, you really can't. They're just too tight when they're new. And I just find that if you just tap it with something rubber. Okay, to get it in, it's this way up, and the pin needs to be that way towards the back of the car, so away from the camera. So if you look, see that I've pushed the pin, knocked the pin over, so that it's that side. It goes in easier that way. And what you do is first thing you do is you get off the stool, sit down where you can take the weight. One of the reasons that I was quite keen on cleaning up before I put the new one in is that I knew that that seal would pop out when I pushed it to one side, which is why I want everything to be clean, because with that seal off there is the possibility of dirt getting in there, so if you can clean it up a bit before you start, it's better. I don't know if you saw how I did that, but basically what you've got to do, the pin as far as it can back that way, get this so it's fairly flat, and then you can jiggle the pin so that it's over the top of the hole, and then bring the hub back like that, and then your pin's in, and it's all good. It's unbelievable. That job took me last weekend on the other side when I didn't know what I was doing. It took me best part of an afternoon fiddling around with that before I figured out the trick to it. The next thing to do is to get the stop for the steering stop in, and get the grease nipple in on the other side through this hole and the hole on the other side before you bolt it up, because once you've bolted this up, if that's not in quite the right position, you won't be able to get the stops in or the grease nipple in. Just a tip for when you are putting the grease nipple in on this side and the stop in on this side, put the grease nipple in first probably. The new lower ball joint I got has got the offset style grease nipples, and they are very hard to turn in when you've only got a small hole to work through. So you're probably better off with the straight ones, but if you do have the ones with the offset, put that in first on the far side here, and then put this in, because trying to get the ones with the offset in and turn them is hard. So if you can do that while it's all loose as it will possibly be, and then do this, which is easier. Okay, so I've got those two in. The next thing to do is to put the 4 bolts in here, and then I'll tighten up the knuckle down the bottom. One thing that you should check at this point is that this rubber is in, and with the wire clamp down there in seated, because as I mentioned before, when you've got this all fully offset and you're mucking around trying to get it in, it does tend to pop out. Okay, that's all seated back in. I think I'm happy with that. Now I just put these 4 bolts in. Okay, that's those 4 bolts on. Now I've just got to do the crown bolt underneath. This castle nut down here is supposed to be up to, well, actually various manuals I've got give different figures, but it's somewhere between 130 and 170 Newton meters, so I'm going to do it to 145. Final thing to do is I've just got to put the split pin in. Okay, now I've put the top ball joint back in, which is a lot easier. Now, one thing I've noticed with these is that you virtually have to take the rubber off to get it to go through the hole. The hole's pretty tight. Okay, so that goes in. Okay, so the rubber seal's back on and seated. Now, this pin has to go through the hole here, and as you can see at the moment it's too high. Lower the jack down so that this drops enough that I can get it into. I'm going to use some Loctite on this because there was Loctite on it when I undid it, so I doubt these ball joints have been changed since the car was built, so if Mitsubishi think it needs Loctite, I guess I will use Loctite. I can't find anywhere in the manual that it says what torque these are supposed to be at, so I'm just doing them up as tight as I can. So that's that in. Now this is where having put the C-clamp on comes into its own, because if you don't have that clamp on here, when you try to jack this up and pull the pin, or pull this up over the pin to get it on, what happens is the control arm just goes up, and it's annoying. But with that C-clamp on, it can't do that. That's it. That's now seated in properly, and that's good. Now the I don't know if you can see that there, but now the threaded part of the pin is through. I'm going to put the castle nut on. The castle nut on the upper ball joint is supposed to be at I believe 90 meters. Sudden jump here, but it's actually the next day. I didn't realize that my phone had gone flat yesterday and it wasn't filming, but luckily it stopped filming when I'd basically finished. The only thing I had left to do was to put the brake caliper back on, and that's pretty simple. So just to sum up, the key points as to how you do this without needing to take the whole hub off are that you keep the jack down here in place and holding the control arm up for the whole job. If the control arm is allowed to drop down, I certainly was not able to get the lower control arm ball joint pin back in with the control arm down, so you have to have it jacked up. So it's, that seems to help. The other thing is to have the upper ball joint completely out at the time that you're dealing with the lower ball joint, because that way you have the maximum freedom of movement to wiggle the hub back and lay it down sufficiently to be able to get the pin of the lower ball joint in and out without having to take the hub off. Anyway, I hope this video has been some use to some people. See you later.